A once beautiful White Star Line ship sat in port in New York City, smoke and steam billowing from her smokestacks as she was loaded with munitions, supplies, and nervous troops setting out for the trenches of World War I. Clad in dazzle paint, it would be difficult to discern that she was Titanic's twin, and her tango with the U-boat would solidify her place in history. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Typically, when we think of the best ocean liners of the 20th century, we think of beautiful, sleek ships with opulent cabins and elegant dining saloons filled with vacationing and traveling passengers dressed to the nines. However, wartime has historically seen these ocean-faring palaces converted into troop ships, hospital ships, and armed merchant cruisers, ferrying thousands of soldiers in a single trip, treating the wounded, and destroying the enemy. Some of the biggest names in these arenas are ships like Mauretania, Olympic, Britannic, Aquitania, Leviathan, New Amsterdam, Queen Mary, and Queen Elizabeth II. Large ocean liners were absolutely necessary to support military operations for two major reasons. Firstly, they were some of the largest vessels afloat, and as such, they could haul massive numbers of soldiers and war materials over long distances. Secondly, these ships were oftentimes some of the fastest ships available. Due to the threat of submarines in both World Wars and the threat of air attack in World War II, speed was one of the greatest defenses a ship could have. While many ocean liners would end up being troop ships, there are some that were turned into armed merchant cruisers, primarily in World War I. They'd be equipped with guns and trained crews, and they would go on the hunt for rival merchant ships, prepared to send them to the bottom of the seas. Though this is an interesting concept, it was not sustainable. Ocean liners could not turn or stop quickly enough to be useful as armed merchant cruisers, which would lead to them being converted into hospital ships or troop ships. A shocking statistic we can take away from World War II is that of all of the branches of the American military, the U.S. Merchant Marine, which consisted of armed merchant cruisers, suffered the highest casualty rate. U-boats patrolled the Atlantic, Pacific, and even made their way to the contiguous United States, so there was no part of the ocean safe from their attacks. These losses would lead to the conversions to hospital ships and troop ships that I mentioned earlier, so ocean liners could remain helpful as they treated the wounded and transported men to and from the war zone. Ocean liners were used extensively during both world wars by all belligerents. For our younger audience members, when I use the term belligerents here, I'm not meaning the adjective that refers to someone who is bullheaded. In this context, the belligerents are the participants in the wars. For example, with World War II, we have the Axis powers and the Allied powers, and each country involved is considered a belligerent. Modern jet transport was one of the nails tapped into the coffin of ocean liners in terms of commercial service. However, they were absolutely necessary during World War II and the Falklands War between Great Britain and Argentina, which was a conflict that was part of the Cold War and lasted 10 weeks from April into June of 1982. This is one of the most recent examples of how critical these beautiful ships were in military operations, as they ferried troops back and forth quickly across the seas. Ocean liners for passenger service already had many of the necessary features for troop transport. Their galleys, dining rooms, and several cabins were built to carry and feed hundreds of people across the world's oceans. The conversion to military use essentially was removing the luxury items and maximizing usable space. First, all of the non-essentials were removed. Think paneling, pianos, excessive seating, paintings, and anything unneeded for sustaining or berthing the maximum number of troops that could be transported. All of the items removed were stored until the ship was finished with wartime service and returned to her owners. In some cases, the ships sank, and their fittings were preserved to this day, like HMHS Britannic's player piano. Every space on the ship was then stuffed to the brim with cots, hammocks, and storage for munitions and supplies to transport troops and supplies to the war zone. For troop ships, especially in World War II, guns were mounted on decks to provide some sort of defensive capabilities. They were not designed to go toe-to-toe with an enemy warship, however these guns were a deterrence for U-boats and attacking airplanes out hunting for these merchant beauties. U-boats would be intimidated into remaining underwater instead of surfacing for an attack, and airplanes looking to drop a hefty bomb would be forced to go to higher altitudes, decreasing the accuracy of their aim. In the beginning of World War II, the guns were crewed by merchant seamen. They lacked the training and discipline of the military, so it was believed they were not as effective at firing the guns, and so gun crews of enlisted personnel would take over in the later part of the war. To protect themselves in times of war, ocean liners were often camouflaged with dazzle paint or dazzle camouflage, which was a series of patterns and colors painted on a ship in order to confuse the enemy and disguise which direction a ship was going. The colors and patterns would make it difficult to discern the size, speed, heading, and type of ship when viewed from a distance. The concept was developed by marine artist Norman Wilkinson, and its effectiveness is debated. It was primarily used in World War I, but did follow into World War II. One of the greatest contributions dazzle paint made was to the morales of the crew sailing on these ships, as they believed everything humanly possible was being done to ensure their survival, and this was a comfort to them as they passed through hostile waters. The ocean liners that survived their wartime service would go through another conversion, and this time it was back into passenger service. Their guns would be stripped from them, vital repairs made, and their fittings reinstalled. After this, they would go back to passenger service for their respective owners. Sadly, many of the great ocean liners that went to war never returned home, with many lost to enemy action in both world wars. Virtually no example of wartime ocean liners still exists. However, RMS Queen Mary in Long Beach, California did survive World War II, and she exists as a hotel and museum ship to this day. Ocean liners were essential during both wartime and passenger service, and they are some of our favorite ships to cover. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show, Shipwreck Sunday, every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Time to look at their notable examples and incidents. The first notable example we have of an extremely successful ocean liner during wartime service is RMS Olympic of the White Star Line, most famous for being the older sister of the ill-fated RMS Titanic. Olympic was considered one of the most successful and beautiful ships ever created, capturing the hearts of many as soon as she hit the seas as the largest ship afloat in 1911. She instantly became the flagship of the White Star Line fleet, and her continuously reliable service over the years gained her the nickname of Old Reliable. Her cruising speed was over 20 knots, and so this made her well-suited as a troop transport ship during World War I when war would break out in 1914. During World War I, Olympic carried massive numbers of troops in both the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters. In 1918, as she was carrying troops from New York City to Great Britain, U-103 surfaced ahead of Olympic in the English Channel, poised to strike. Captain Hayes of Olympic turned the ship toward the U-boat, ramming the submarine and sinking it, being the only merchant ship to have sunk an enemy warship during World War I. In World War II, RMS Queen Mary of the Cunard Line would play a key role in the success of the Allies. She would embark on her maiden voyage in 1936, plagued by propeller vibrations, soot from her funnels, and electrical problems in her first year of service, undergoing a complete overhaul just 1 year after her initial voyage. Her repairs were successful and remedied much of these issues, and she was a blue ribbon winner as of August of 1936, crossing the Atlantic in just 4 days. World War II would begin in September of 1939, and shortly after this, Queen Mary was requisitioned for wartime service, serving as a troop ship. During the course of World War II, she ferried more than 750,000 troops in total, with several instances of her carrying well over 10,000 troops at a time. This was huge because her passenger capacity was 2,140, and the largest amount of troops ever transported in a single crossing was aboard Queen Mary, carrying 15,740 troops and 943 crew for a grand total of 16,683 people crammed like sardines onto the great ocean liner. Her greatest defensive weapon was her enormous speed advantage, and she sailed oftentimes without escorts unlike many other ocean liners. After World War II, Queen Mary was converted back to passenger service and resumed her transatlantic crossings in 1947. After a long and remarkable passenger career, she was retired in 1967, and since 1971, she's been moored at Long Beach, California as a floating hotel, museum ship, convention center, and tourist attraction. If you'd like to make reservations or for more information, visit www.queenmary.com to learn more. Let's look at the Falklands War, which was in 1982. Queen Elizabeth II would be requisitioned and converted into a troop ship in 1982, with her artwork and other passenger amenities being stripped and provisions being made for military service, including a helipad being added to allow helicopters to land on the ship. There was 8,000 miles between Great Britain and the Falklands, which is a tiny group of islands located in a remote portion of the South Atlantic off the coast of Argentina. This meant there was no nearby ports available for refueling, so her great range and capacity were critical to the British getting their troops down to the Falklands to retake the islands from the Argentines. There was a real chance the world could have lost Queen Elizabeth II. The Argentines had sea-skimming Exocet missiles, and they sank several escort vessels and the large Cunard container ship Atlantic Conveyor. Great care was then taken to conceal Queen Elizabeth II, with her radar turned off and all of her many portholes were covered to eliminate any light that could give away her position. She avoided enemy contact and returned to Cunard after the war ended. She is now a 5-star floating hotel in Dubai. Unfortunately for many great liners, they met their end in World War I and World War II. In World War I, HMHS Britannic, the younger sister to Olympic and Titanic, was requisitioned for wartime service. She would be finished as a hospital ship with more than 3,000 berths for the wounded. On November 21, 1916, she struck a sea mine while steaming near the Greek island of Kea. Only 30 of the 1,066 people aboard would perish, thanks to the responsible nature of her crew and the efforts of nearby vessels. Most of those killed were in 2 lifeboats that were launched prematurely, and they were churned up in the propellers. At more than 48,000 tons, HMHS Britannic is the largest passenger shipwreck on the ocean floor to this day, and the largest ship sunk during World War I. In World War II, HMT Lancastria of the Cunard Line would sink and be the worst single ship loss of life in British maritime history. She was a troop ship in World War II and had been tasked with Operation Ariel, the evacuation of British nationals and troops from France. Her passenger capacity was 1,300 passengers, and her troop-carrying capacity was typically 2,180 troops with 330 crew, up to 3,000 troops in a pinch. While trying to escape on June 17, 1940, with between 4,000 and 9,000 people aboard, she was sunk by the Luftwaffe just off of Saint-Nazaire, France, losing an estimated 4,000 to 7,000 people. 2,477 survivors were rescued, and the death toll of Lancastria accounts for about a third of the total losses of the British Expeditionary Force in France. There are numerous examples of ocean liners and passenger ships lost in World War I and World War II, but those two are some notable examples. Ocean liners played a huge role in both peacetime passengers transportation and in winning or losing wars. Though they've all but died out, their impact on society and their legacy is undeniable, as some of the most memorable vessels for society are ocean liners. When we think of popular historic vessels, some of the first few that come to mind are Titanic, Lusitania, Queen Mary, and Ile-de-France, among others. No matter whether they were lost or survived the wars they served in, ocean liners were undeniably dominant on the seas. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Ocean Liners playlist in the cards. Stay tuned this Sunday for the story of SS Rex, a beautiful Italian ocean liner that was destroyed by the Royal Air Force in World War II. Thank you for tuning into Fast Facts Friday. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time.